Okay, I'll take advantage of that brief hush to introduce today's speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce a former graduate student and a world-renowned insect photographer, Alex Weil. Alex is originally from upstate New York, he reminded me a few minutes ago. And he went to Bowdoin College for his undergraduate degree. That was followed by a 3 or 4 year stint in the Peace Corps in Paraguay. Quite important formative years there. And then he came to UC Davis, did his PhD here in my lab, working on ant systematics. At the same time, he began this parallel life as he developed these skills as a photographer and basically all-rounded naturalist. And that's what he's actually become most well known for, although he's a superb ant systematist too. I don't want to abandon that field entirely. He did a postdoc with David Madison at the University of Arizona after being here, and then a second postdoc at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where he's currently based. And he'll be talking today about this second parallel part of his life, which is not ant systematics, but photography. Thanks.
All right, Louis, lights. Let's not damage the microphone here. So, I'm going to give a talk that is not the usual research entomology talk that we get for the Wednesday seminar series. Can you all hear me, by the way, before I get too far into this? Can you hear me at the back? Okay. So, I'm going to talk about how to take better insect photographs. And the reason why I'm going to talk about this is many of you here, I'd say most of you here, are scientists, graduate students in the sciences, and scientists have a lot of need for images. Could be lab web pages, could be presentations, you might have a blog, you make a poster. Imagery is a really useful tool for scientists to have. And I, for that reason, sort of feel like as part of the standard set of tools we learn as graduate students, it's helpful to just cultivate your ability with a camera a little bit. Much in the same way you might learn how to make a good conference poster as a graduate student. I think it's a good idea to learn how to take a better photograph of your subject. So what I'm going to do for the next half an hour or so is just talk really briefly about the equipment involved in photography, from cell phone cameras up to the more expensive SLR professional gear. I'm then going to go through just some basic pointers for how you take insect photographs. And finally, if we have time at the end, I'm going to show some images, and we're just going to kind of reverse engineer them. Also, if you have a question during the talk, feel free to interrupt me and just ask away. I'd like this to be fairly informal, so don't be shy about interrupting me. All right, the first bit about equipment. Most cameras that you could use to take photos of bugs fall into two categories. There are, on one hand, the large, heavy SLR cameras. Hey, Alex has got one there. You want to hold that up? That's an SLR camera. It's got interchangeable lenses. That's the main feature. You buy the lens separate from the camera. And this is the sort of gear that most professionals use. I've made a nice little chart here that, oh, that's not a pointer. A chart here that compares the SLRs to what I'd call the digicams, which are smaller, more self-contained units. So the SLRs, there are two things to know about them. One I've already mentioned. They have the interchangeable lenses. That means that you can optically do a lot of different things with them just by using them in combination with different bits of glass. They also have a really large sensor chip in them. And that means they're averaging over a lot more incoming light to make an image. Compare that to a smaller camera, which has a very small sensor. Small sensors tend to have smaller pixels. Each one of those is making a judgment call on the incoming light based on much less data. It's a big camera, big sensor, big pixels. A lot of photons are hitting each individual pixel before the camera says, aha, I'm going to call this blue, and sends that off. There's very little error as a result in the SLR sensors, whereas the little tiny sensors, they got little pixels, they make a very quick judgment call on very little data. High variance, what does that mean? That means the images are noisier and full of artifacts. That's one reason why SLRs take such pretty smooth, nice, creamy pictures, is because they got these huge sensors. On the other hand, the SLRs are big and heavy and cumbersome, and if you're going on a backpacking trip in the Sierra, you really want to be carrying 5 pounds of camera gear with you with all your interchangeable lenses. Plus, they're expensive, and here's one major point I'd like to make about them. Because they're so large, big sensors, big lenses, when you're photographing little things, a beetle next to the front of one of those really big lenses looks rather small. Now, what if you had a little tiny camera with a little tiny sensor and a little tiny bit of glass? You put the same beetle next to a little tiny Digicam, put it next to your iPhone, and it's huge. With the result that the little tiny inexpensive Digicams, the little point and shoots, actually take better pictures of insects in this area than the really expensive professional gear. It's something called wide angle macro. Those little cameras get their magnification by allowing you to get really close to the subject rather than having any sort of inherent magnification in that. So those little inexpensive cameras, there are things you can do with them. Here's an example. These are images that I've taken with a little $200 Panasonic Lumix Digicam. These are wide. I've zoomed all the way out, so they're full wide, and I put the camera right next to the insect, and it's correspondingly big. And this is a look that you can go for with the inexpensive cameras. If you are going to be doing a bit of photography, don't necessarily discount, say, oh, I only have like this little $150 whatever, or I only have a cell phone. You can actually do some pretty amazing things with these. So this is the look of a Digicam. Notice also, the thing about the little cameras, they have a lot of what's called depth of field. So they get a lot more of sort of the environment, stuff going on in the background. So Digicam is really good at, here it is obviously in a suburban neighborhood with houses in the backdrop, and here's some chives, and you can see all the flowers. These are both shots that are very hard to get with the expensive SLR interchangeable lens gear, where they're relatively easy with the Digicam. In contrast, what does a typical SLR insect image look like? It looks more like this, where the colors are beautiful, it is crispy, creamy, smooth, you've got this lovely backdrop that is undistracting because there's not much detail in it. This is the sort of image that an SLR camera does really superbly. But it's a different kind of image, and recently I've actually started taking both. I've got my 5 pounds of camera gear, and I'm adding more to it. But I also like bringing a little camera to the field because I can do those other things with it. I took this image with a macro lens. A macro lens is something you're going to need. You don't need, but you should have if you're going to be taking insect photographs. It is just a lens, regular camera lens, that also allows you to focus relatively close. And this is a fairly standard Canon macro lens, 100 millimeter. Great thing about most macro lenses is they're also general lenses. So this same lens that I took that stick insect picture with, I've also taken landscapes and weddings. It's a great wedding lens as well. And so you buy a macro lens, you're not restricting yourself to taking just photos of tiny things. It's a really good, just sort of general lens investment. There are lots of other things, bits of equipment that you can do to increase your magnification. General macro lenses, if you buy one, you're actually not going to get a huge amount of magnification out of them. In fact, some of the little cell phone cams, Digicams, actually can take higher magnification pictures than some of your standard SLR macro lenses. So if you really want to do close-ups on the head of an ant, you have to move into this much more specialized area. I use a lens called the MPE lens. Canon makes it. But the genius of this lens, it's exactly the same thing as the old bellows system. There's an optical thing where the farther away you make the front element of the glass from your film or your sensor, the closer in you can focus. So in the past, photographers have made all these contraptions, this really long tube made out of bellows or extension tube or something with this little lens on the front. And Canon recently made this lens that, by recently I mean like 15 years ago. Anyway, they made this lens that is optically the same as these cumbersome old systems, but it's just a single one-piece unit that's really easy to use. And so you can buy it as one thing and it works great, and you can do different levels of magnification with it. Here's an example of the sort of image I've taken with the MPE lens. Again, it's really much more closely in on the subject. And here's what this lens looks like on the camera when I'm at full magnification. It has moved. This thing is just a big hollow tube. It has just moved the front element way out here, and optically, the further this goes out, the closer in you can focus. You can do exactly the same thing for much cheaper if you just take a regular lens and then buy a bunch of extension tubes. Or I've actually seen, this is great, you can look this up on the internet. People take a Pringles can and just tape it to the camera, and they tape their lens to the front. And you can do the same thing for actually much cheaper. And because it's just hollow space in here, you're not adding you're not making the image quality any worse. You're just saving yourself some money. A little more inconvenient to use, but here's an extension tube in work. Here's me just holding an extension tube. You can see it's just a hollow tube. It has some electrical connections, so it can talk to the lens, but you actually don't need it. A regular, just sort of standard camera lens, the sort of thing you might get with your kit lens if you buy an SLR. This is, let's go back. Okay, this is a picture of a spider. See it? Camouflage against bark. Regular lens, that's as close as I can get. If I take the same lens and just put a little short extension tube on it, by moving the lens away from the camera, away from the sensor, I lose the ability to focus on that mountain all the way over there, way off, but I gain the ability to focus in closer. And so the same lens, just added that, I can get suddenly closer. So extension tubes are a really great thing to have. They're inexpensive, and you can transform any regular camera lens into something you can use to take photos of bugs with. Here's an example. This is a regular wide-angle lens I normally use to shoot, the Grand Canyon or something. But I put it on, and I put this wide-angle lens on the extension tube, and suddenly I can really cozy up to this bullet ant and get a nice photo of it. Again, this is much less expensive than buying a dedicated macro lens. Here's a honeybee. This is the same setup I used to photograph the spider. It's just a $150 lens with a extension tube, and suddenly I can get close enough to a bee to do this. Of course, this took about 2 afternoons and maybe 500 or 1,000 shots of how to focus things, which I'm never going to show anyone. Anyway, before I finish the equipment section, I'm just going to talk about cell phones, since now most phones seem to ship with a camera. These are really great for insects because the lenses are so small, so you put one next to an insect and the thing just looks like a monster. The trouble is that cell phone cameras usually don't focus that closely. They'll focus starting about a foot away. You can on eBay buy these little lenses. This is like 20 bucks, or just use a hand lens. This is like a hand lens. I've just taped it. That's lab tape, and that's a hand lens. And this setup, I just put this in front of. This is a Polistes wasp, and that's an iPhone 3, which doesn't take great images, but this is fine for. Like I wouldn't make a poster out of that. That's full resolution. But it's fine for a talk or a blog entry or anything. And that, again, that's a cell phone. These little cameras can really do insects dramatically. So I would definitely experiment with that if you have one before going and dropping a ton of money on one of these brick-like things professionals would use. All right, some guidelines, general guidelines for taking pictures of insects. Manual mode. Most cameras have a little setting with an M. You put it on manual. Because insects are so small, when you're working with that little tiny area, the depth of field is really thin. The cameras have a very poor time figuring out what you're trying to do when you're shooting an insect. So all these cameras with all their smart algorithms and attempts to autofocus do very poorly with insects. So just turn it to manual and learn how to adjust what you need to manually, and suddenly everything becomes a lot easier because you don't have a camera trying to second guess everything you're doing. So manual mode is always helpful. When you're in manual mode, you're suddenly given all these choices of things to set your camera to, and this is the one that's most confusing. Well, it was most confusing to me. Aperture. What is aperture? Well, lenses, most lenses now, they're not just glass. There's a little diaphragm in the middle that constricts down. So you look through a lens, normally it's wide open, but just before you take a shot, this little diaphragm will constrict down to a little opening, and then it'll take the picture and it'll open up again. So this figure shows what looking in the front of the lens might do when you're at f2.8. That's wide open. This is just a fraction, so that you know, as the denominator gets bigger, the number gets smaller, the constriction gets smaller. And this on the left is what an image looks like. This top one looks like it's out of focus, but it's not actually out of focus. If you look here and here, this one little bit is very sharply in focus. This is how lenses normally work. There's a very narrow plane that's focused on, and the rest is blurry. Now, as I stop down, it gets narrow. The constriction gets narrower and narrower. The amount of light getting to the camera is less and less. But here I'm using a flash, so I just bump the flash up every time I do this. You can see that more and more of this ant is in focus, the smaller the constriction gets. So when we're photographing insects, you want a lot of aperture, so I spend a lot of time shooting down in that area. And this is just an example of what this looks like in practice. If I just shoot a lens wide open, you get this very dreamy look, which is some really nice artistic shots you can get out of this. But if you're doing something that's more illustrative for maybe a journal paper or something where you want to see more of the insect, you're more likely going to need to be stopped down. Now this introduces several problems, but there's a trade-off with making a really small aperture. The smaller that aperture gets, the fuzzier the image gets overall. So you shoot wide open, and you've got a very narrow but very crisp photograph. The smaller the aperture, the focal depth really spreads out, but also squishes down, so the images look soft. So if you stop all the way down, and this is what I call 100% crop. It is I've just taken the little center part of the image and blown it up. You can see that this is actually not very crisp. This is kind of, this is sort of fuzzy around the edges. So you don't want to stop all the way down. You want to find that sort of sweet point where you're stopped down but not all the way down. And so you just kind of play around with the settings in any particular camera and find what works best. But anyway, stop down but not all the way down. The problem with stopping down, the other problem is that there's not much light. It's a little tiny hole you're trying to get all this light through. So to compensate, the normal way cameras compensate for shooting with a really small aperture is to leave the shutter open longer. Shutter being this little thing that sits in front of the sensor and just opens for a time and then closes. So if you're shooting a small aperture, your camera wants to just open it and let more light in, so it'll gather more light. The problem is anything that's moving during the time that shutter is open is going to be recorded as a blur. So this is what a picture looks like with a really small aperture, and I've just let the camera do what it wants to do, and it just leaves the shutter open for a while, and the beetle is blurry. So how do I compensate? Well, I use a lot of flash. So I take an off-camera flash, and I sort of bathe that thing in light, and that means that I can use both a really short shutter speed, and because the flash is just a pulse of light, it just sort of freezes everything in the instant. So these sorts of photos are taken small aperture that gives you this depth, and a flash, which provides enough light to compensate for the small aperture. Having said that, rules are meant to be broken, and so motion is something you can play with for an artistic feel. Like if I just was along this this trail of ants, and if I was just sweeping the camera along with a relatively long shutter speed at the same speed of the ants running over the ground, and most of the photos were kind of cruddy, but every once in a while you get one that works pretty well where your subject is in focus, and that really communicates motion. So you can break these rules and get some nice images sometimes. Now, here's what I'm going to consider one of the most important points is light. Photography, of course, is the recording of light. I mean, what does a camera do? It's recording photons. So you really want to spend time thinking about your light, thinking about where it's coming from, the direction, what color it is, and how intense or diffuse it is. And playing with light is really what opens up a lot of possibilities for photography. This is an example of an ash sawfly just sitting there. This is actually an apple in the background. For some reason I've started using fruit recently. I think this was lying around my kitchen. But anyway, this is a bug on a stick, and I photographed it just by changing the light. This is an ambient light, so I just let the shutter sit open for a while. The camera's on a tripod, so it wouldn't shake. And I produced this kind of image, and if you might not be able to see it from where you are, but the antennae, because this thing was sitting there doing this, the antennae are blurry, which is not the effect I wanted. So how about I make the shutter speed go really quick, but I need to use flash to get enough light, so here's a bare flash. I just take the flash and bam, and didn't diffuse it, and you can see you just get these little shiny spots. And the little shiny spots here, they look kind of unnatural. So what happens if I take the flash and instead of giving it that bam, I put it through diffusing paper. So there's just white plastic stuff. It's like almost like those old plastic milk cartons or something. It's that sort of translucent material. You shine the flash through that, and suddenly it looks more like a cloudy day. I could just shine the flash on the backdrop, which makes a silhouette. I could turn the flash around from behind and backlight it, which gives me some highlighting. Or I can combine the diffuse flash and the backlight to make this image, which is lit diffusely from the front but has a little bit of a kick from the back. So it combines these into this look. And that's just varying the light. I get these different effects. And just some more examples of this in practice. Here are some leafcutter ants. This one is lit from the back. You can even see I didn't get the strobe out of the way enough, and so I ended up using this one a lot as sort of a teaching image because you can see where the light's coming from. Translucent things look really great when backlit because the colors really go zing, and the insects get these pleasing little halos. You get these lovely colors. Exact same situation, flash from the front looks like this. You can see the color quality is very different. Or I can just shoot with natural light. This is no flash at all, longer exposure. I had to wait till the ants were kind of sitting partly still to take this. And 3 very different images of the same subject just by altering the light and where this came from. Here's another example. Ant on a leaf. This bottom image here, I had a flash that was held just above the leaf. And so the flash flashed and it reflects off the top of the leaf here, makes an image like this. Now if I add a second flash underneath the leaf, so the leaf is being lit from below while the ant is lit from the top, I suddenly get this nice glowing effect on the leaf. Again, just changing the lighting, very dramatic difference. I added this slide in because of all the wonderful bee people here. I thought I should show some bees. Very similar thing, bees on some ripening honey, and this is a diffuse flash from the top, looks like this. A flash from behind just backlights everything, looks like this. If I use both, where some lighting is coming from the front and some from behind, I get one that looks like this. Lots of differences based on how you light it. Finally, one of my favorite lighting tricks is to make it look like a nice cloudy day. And I use this trick called a white box. These are really expensive. This is an old toilet paper box and some old printer paper and some tape. And all I do is I position a flash inside the white box and fired off facing upward away from the subject. So anything sitting in that white box out of the line of the direct flash gets bathed momentarily in this beautiful white even light. It makes it look like a product photo from eBay, one of those things. And they're really easy to make. You just have to have an off-camera flash and some paper in a box lying around. Here's an example of a photograph taken of a very shiny beetle using that technique.
Where's the subject in relation to the box?
So in this one, it's kind of down near the bottom. I've hung, to make this green background, I usually hang some green leaves just sort of along the back, or I put a green piece of paper along the back. So it's the main thing is it's out of line of sight of the flash. So the flash is flashing up. I might put a little tape along the sides to prevent direct glare. But otherwise, it's just the flash bouncing off the top of the box. And I'll make these all the time. Like if I show up in a lab to photograph some study subject, I'll just grab a box and some printer paper and tape it together. So I like about doing insect photography is you can build a whole studio. They're so small. It's like we have these godlike qualities. We can arrange everything how we like it, and these white boxes are really quite easy to make. Okay, so moving on from lighting, some basic composition things. This is sort of photography 101 stuff. There's this thing called rule of thirds, which a lot of photographers swear by. Again, it's another rule meant to be broken. But what is the rule of thirds? If you divide the camera frame into thirds, and I've got two ways to do this, is vertical third lines and horizontal third lines. There's something about the psychology of how, or the neurology of how we humans visualize things. If we see an image where the major elements are arrayed along these third lines, what was just an image somehow becomes a story. Images magically become better when we place things away from the center along these third lines. This is a really crude example. Here's a flower, and I move it to the side, and it becomes a somewhat better image. It's not a great example, but that's just sort of, if you're photographing something, it's just to say, don't point your camera right at it. Point it at it, focus, and then kind of move around to figure out where you're going to put the main subject. This is an example of a cicada killer wasp on a flower. Here's the third lines. I've got the eye here positioned along the left third line, and even I've got the top third line coinciding with the wing here. This is just really simple compositional things you can do with any camera. Doesn't matter which one, which kind. Just moving things away from the center along the third lines. Now the thing is, once you learn the rule of thirds, it kind of ruins everything, like movies and everything for you, because you start seeing it everywhere. And this is so rule of thirds it hurts. Like Joel and Ethan Coen have just made there's the line, there's the bottom third line, and look at the lines on the ceiling. Where do they converge? The third line right there. And ad nauseum. You see it now. I see it all the time, right? Look at that. There's a third line. It's right along the top of the cliff, right there. And then Walter and the dude. It's So now every time I can't actually watch anything on television anymore. It's like, rule of thirds. My wife's like, bam, shut up. I said that. But it's a very simple trick that makes everything really better, and it's very simple. Now the other thing, and this is tricky for me to think about. Simple backdrops increase visual impact. One sort of revelation that I probably should have had earlier, but I've only had it more recently, is that we don't really see with our eyes, we see with our brains. So much of what we think we're seeing is actually heavily post-processed up here. And we're surrounded, just look around the room, we're just surrounded by so much visual information everywhere. There's the ceiling tiles and the stuff on the wall and the stuff on the floor, and just there's so much information out there that our brains are receiving. And we would go into meltdown if we had to process it all simultaneously. And so our brains are continuously ignoring stuff, just putting stuff out of the way. It's just a giant filter. Have you guys seen the video of follow the ball through there, and you'd miss the guy in the gorilla suit that's walking through. I mean, it's that sort of thing. Is we're constantly having to get rid of information. And one thing that our brains use to get rid of extraneous information is the fact that we have binocular vision. We see two different images at the same time, which you'd think would make the matter even worse, because now we're processing images from two different sources. But what binocular vision allows us to do is to pinpoint how far away things are, right? Like close one eye and look around. And this is a much more difficult thing to do than if you have both eyes open. Everything seems to fall into place more. Why? It's because with two eyes, we know exactly how far away things are. And our brain uses that to say, I'm looking at stuff close, I'm going to ignore everything back there. Photographs are a single two-dimensional image. So immediately, when we're looking at a single photograph, our brains no longer have that capability of being able to use binocular vision to get rid of everything out there. So what this means is photographs succumb to clutter much more readily than scenes in real life do. So it's almost like when you take a picture, it has to be almost a caricature of what's out there. You have to strip away all sorts of unnecessary elements in order for it to have the same impact. What have I done with this photograph? This is taken with a fairly long lens, and the backdrop is far away. It's a standard SLR image, so the backdrop kind of washes away out of focus. And I've got flash directed on just the subject, so it's illuminated a bit more. So normally, if I were to see this in the field, in natural light, there would just be grass and debris and everything, and it wouldn't be as compelling an image. So I spent a lot of time when I'm composing photographs finding the right angle to shoot from, so there's less clutter in the picture. Getting the right backdrop. Here's an example of some mosquito larvae. I just had them in this little beaker, and it's actually this setup. I just stuck a leaf in behind there to provide a more sort of continuous, solid color, and I sort of lit the whole thing from behind with a flash. And that simplified the backdrop to make it an easier picture to look at. You can also do this with colors and textures. This is a really cluttered backdrop on the surface, but it's cluttered in all the same way. It's sort of an even textured gray, and the subject stands out from it because it's different. And I had to spend some time thinking about this. This is one of the jewel beetles, and it actually, I believe the larvae is an oak inhabiting beetle, so I went and found a slab of oak because I thought maybe that would be a nice thing that would be too contrived. This is also incidentally a white box image, so I stuck this whole thing in one of those white boxes to get that even light. All right, other guidelines. Here's something you have a lot of control over in a lot of insect photography. Maybe not if you're shooting butterflies or dragonflies from far away, but you can pick your perspective. And by that I mean two things. One is you can either choose an SLR lens or you can have zoom on your camera. There's sort of two ends. You have wide, you zoom all the way out and you get the full picture, or you have long, which is like a little telescope, zooming in. These tell very different stories. These are beehives. If you shoot wide and you get right close to it, shooting wide, you get this really much more dramatic in the element. I mean, this hive is right in your face in this picture. Or you can use a long lens, and this sort of backs away. And if you had a digicam, you just sort of use your zoom all the way in. And these images look much more like postcards, much more serene, and it depicts more of a distant scene. So you can have very different emotional impacts on what you shoot, depending on whether you want to go wide or long. Here's an example with insects. A wide lens, this is an extension tube on a regular sort of wide angle lens. You get the insect retreating away and you get all the environment in, and it's a fairly dramatic picture of the whole environment. You shoot long and you get this much more serene picture with a very smooth backdrop that isn't there. It's a very different, you can really change the composition just by changing how much zoom you're using on the lens. Yes? Question?
When I took the long angle, how was it lit? Was it outside?
Oh man, this is outside. I have beehives in my backyard, and I just sort of this took about 2 weeks to make this image because first time I had to figure out when the lighting was right. And it turned out at a particular time of day, this is in October, where the sun's relatively low. The sun comes in from behind, reflects off the front of the beehive to give a little bit of a fill in the front. And so once I figured out that that's the time of day I wanted to shoot this, then I would just go out there every day and take my camera and just go and just delete. It was about 8,000 exposures, and that was the best of them. So yeah, that's the other element is how you don't magically suddenly take better pictures when you're professional photographers. Really just spend a lot of time and throw out a lot of images to get there. But anyway, here's another issue of perspective. Do you want the viewer of your image to empathize with you, the photographer, or do you want them to empathize with the insect, the arthropod you're shooting? And the perspective here is very important. If you're making a field guide and your viewers are people who are walking on a trail and they look down on a leaf and see a bug, you want to shoot from that angle. Like this is an image where it is about the spider, but it's a view that we as these huge lumbering primates looking down at them, what we see of it. Whereas this image, same spider, it's on the same backdrop, zoomed in a little bit more, but this image is about the spider. It really gives a lot of emotional impact to an image of an insect if you get to its level or below. There's nothing, I think, that makes people say, wow, more about an insect photo than forcing someone to look up at an insect. So I really recommend playing a lot with the angle you're shooting insects from. It really changes the impact. Finally, if you're shooting lots of images, I often find it helpful to take some photographs of the people who are working with these images because it tells more of a story. So it's often fun to just sort of shoot people with their research projects. This is Jeremy Davis, who's actually a graduate student here for a while. This is him in his postdoc position in Arizona with some walnut flies out of fake walnut he made. I think it's a ping pong ball painted green. Anyway, I like having some people pictures sort of mixed in as a way to tell a story. Why? Well, we're social primates. People really like looking at images of other people, it turns out. So if you're taking a series of photos to tell a story, it's helpful to have humans in there to give the readers something a little bit more to relate to. Finally, if I had to distill everything down into some simple points to remember, it's these three things. Don't worry about the camera too much. Everyone says, this is the standard question when you're starting into buying a photography setup, what camera should I buy? That's the wrong question. The camera is just a recording device. I mean, it is important, but it's one of the least important parts of your kit. The image is actually formed by the lenses. So the better question is, what lenses do you want to have? That's a much more important question. The way I figure it out is I just look around on the internet and see what pictures I like. And I see what lenses they're using, and say, I want that. But you buy a lens. The lens that I use for most of my pictures, this Canon MPE lens, cost $800 in 2003 when I bought it, and it's over $1,000 now, the same lens. I could sell it used for more than I bought it for. The camera back that I bought at the same time, I could probably sell for $150 now when it was about $2,000 when I bought it. The camera is going to depreciate. It's not worth very much. It's losing money as you're driving home with it. Don't worry about the camera. They're all good enough. Worry about lenses, and because lighting is so important, worry about your flash units. And just to reiterate that, lighting, lighting, and lighting. I mean, you're recording light with a camera. Pay a lot of attention to where it's coming from and what it looks like, and simplify the composition. So lenses, lighting, and simple. Finally, I'd say I really started getting good as a photographer, better as a photographer, once I could look at other people's photographs and figure out what they did. And so I play this little game where I'll look at a photograph and try to reverse engineer what the heck the guy did to make that image. And so I just want to close this talk with a little succession of images here that sort of show this point. I'll start off with this one. This is an Invalid Chrysalis that I photographed in Ecuador recently. And this one is relatively easy to reverse engineer because it's a self-portrait. That's me right there reflected, and I've got a tripod here and camera on a tripod. And I shot this without any flash. It's just natural light, camera on a tripod, and I was holding up a big piece of white paper right next to it. So this is a motionless subject. There was a green leaf in the background that had a little bit of sun coming on, so it was light coming from the back, and I just put a long exposure and held a piece of paper. Again, this is a long lens. You can tell that because it's got that nice smooth backdrop. You don't see much of the environment there. All right, what did I do with this photograph? Anyone want to take a guess as to where the light was coming from this thing? Here's a hint. You look at the eyes. I've got 1, 2 main sources of light, and a third one down here. So what I had was 2 diffuse flashes coming down from the top. Right underneath the frame here is a piece of paper. And so you see this nice white reflections coming at the bottom. That's just like a piece of printer paper. I had a wasp sitting on a leaf. And yeah, just put 2 flashes down, one more from this side, one from that side. And the yellow at the background is a lemon. I'm not kidding about the fruit thing. It's great. It's just a lemon. And this is just, the light's falling away from it, so it makes this nice dramatic thing when really it's just a lemon.
So how long does it take you to make the decision to light it that way? Does bugs move around?
I'm doing this on the fly, and so what I'm doing is taking about 25 to 30 images here, 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 here. This is what I love about digital. Never would have done this with film. I'll start off and say, well, I think maybe I'll light it this way, but I almost never end up doing that. So I can just try different things. Now, if I have a moving insect, then I'll take my best shot. Like, I think this is going to work, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. This happened to be a wasp that had just come out of its winter burrow, and it had Strepsiptera embedded in it, which is why I took this picture, to sort of show those little things. Yeah, but it takes a lot. Yes?
Were you shooting that with an MT24?
Yes, that was what was done with this. So I made a little diffuse tint over the top.
Okay,
of
so
this
that's what I was going to ask. I struggle with diffusing that thing so much because the light's so harsh.
Yeah, the light is very harsh on that flash, and what I found works best is to not put the diffuser on the flash heads, but to actually make a little tent that sits over the subject itself. I actually attach that to the front of the lens, and then the flash heads sort of fire through that. It's a really tricky lens. The flash heads are too low, too.
Yeah.
I don't know why they put them that low, because if you just raise those flash heads up about an inch, they diffuse much better when you flash through something. But yeah, it's a tough lens. All right, what do I do with this one? Did I backlight this?
Yes.
Yes. But also you can see a little bit of a reflection here. So I had a weak flash coming from my side, but a stronger flash from behind. And that is what makes the leaf glow and gives the little highlights on the ants. And because it's all lit with flash, the backdrop is dropping away to nothing there. This one. So what I did here, this is just a natural forest. So I exposed so that, just using a combination of ISO and shutter speed and aperture just to get the forest exposed. And then I was just holding a flash right over the top of this cicada to bump it up relative to the back. But this is a kind of a balancing act between what's going on in the background and the foreground. Again, it's not like a magical formula. Literally what I'm doing was, bam, oh, that was awful. Let's turn the flash down. Bam, that's too much. And just going back and forth until I get it right. I spent a lot of time looking at the back of the camera, and there's nothing wrong with that. Here, what did I do with this one?
Lightbox?
Yes, that is the light box. So I had a leaf, an old sycamore leaf, beetle on it, running around like mad. So this was kind of lucky that I even got this. But anyway, yeah, so I just fired off a flash in a white box and made this nice, lovely, diffuse lighting.
How
Yeah.
often, I know some people will cool insects down from moving as much. And how often are you doing that, or are you just pretty much letting them?
So I don't do that very often for the main reason, I mean, it does work to slow them down, but it also has other effects. Like they'll sometimes won't hold their legs right if they're chilled, or you get telltale because it's cold, it gets condensation on it. So you can sometimes tell chilled insects because they have little water droplets on them. So that's a tricky one. Sometimes what I'll do is often I've seen photos I have just insects on white backgrounds. I just have them on a piece of white paper under a petri dish. And so I'll set up like 10 insects on, each one under a petri dish, and I'll let them tire themselves out. And then when they're just sort of sitting there, I'll pull the petri dish off really slowly, and I'll usually get about 2 or 3 seconds where I can fire off some shots before the thing wakes up and starts running again. And so there's a lot of patience, but little tricks like that. Some insects react better to chilling, but I don't do that too much just because they look obviously weird. Okay, what did I do here?
Looks like you went outside.
Yes, I did nothing here. What I did was I just happened to see this fell leaf cutting ants coming down a tree. The tree behind it is in shadow, so this is relatively dark, and this is just natural lighting. So and this is what I would recommend doing if you don't have an SLR with an external flash. If you are just shooting with a Digicam, the on-camera flash is horrible on those. But if you pick your moment, if you look for particular scenes where the natural lighting is really nice and dramatic, like backlit here, that's where those little cameras really shine, is in these natural lighting situations. Because they actually do better with low light situations than the SLRs do in some of this wide angle stuff. Here, this is also the delicate balancing act again between, I originally metered the camera to expose on this backdrop here. Guy just came along and started fishing. I was like, oh, I'm so getting this. And then I realized that I was lying in poison ivy. And these are all ants this is a massive ant battle. This happens around town in Davis too, this Tetramorian heads these battles. Anyway, I was like, should I lie in the poison ivy? Should I not lie? And I was like, guys fishing, I'm lying in the poison ivy. Did have a rash, so it wasn't fun. This is another light box image. This is one, kind of had to make a weird light box because I'm looking down at it. And so I made a hole in the top of it at the light box to get that centipede in. Here is straight up backlit, right? Just hold the flash kind of behind the insect and bam, you get the nice. And again, backlighting, I really recommend it when you have translucent things like the telainen of the housefly emerging from the area. And I think this is the last one. What did I do here?
Natural lighting.
Yes, I went outside again. This is right around sunset, and I positioned myself, so I really like that backlit look. I don't know if I've mentioned that. I really like the backlit look of translucent things, and so the flower petals come across really well, and so just walking around outside. And again, this is a fairly long lens, so you get that smooth backdrop. Oh, one last. This is the last one. What did I do here? Flashlight. Yeah. Sometimes you can make things interesting just by making a little flashlight. You can tell I didn't diffuse it because the shadows are really strong. So this is a single point source of light, and it's held right overhead. Anyway, that's what I have. So pay attention to your lenses. Pay attention to lighting. Pay attention to lighting. Pay attention to lighting. And try to keep the backdrop simple. And that's my advice for how to take better insect photographs. Thanks. Yeah, Eric.
I didn't hear you mention a ring flash. I didn't even hear you mention that the flash is mounted on the camera very often. What's your take?
Oh, I take the flash off the camera whenever I can, because having a flash coming right from the lens where it's shooting from gives you that deer in the headlights look. I mean, it's like, if Yeah, so I tend to take the flash off or mount it on a little bracket or do something to have it coming down from the top or the side or the back. Ring flash, I don't like ring flash for that reason in particular. There's one situation where ring flash I think is really useful. I mean, the main problem is you're putting light coming from an unnatural direction. I mean, light normally doesn't come directly. It's like you're walking around with flashlights strapped to your head, and light doesn't normally come from that. However, light normally comes from the top. And if you're doing a scene where you're looking down on something, ring flashes take really nice photos of beetles and things taken just from directly above to below. So if you're doing field guide shots of like the backs of beetles or bugs, ring flashes are actually really useful. Outside that context, they look weird. Other questions?
How much are you using a tripod versus hand holding?
I don't use a tripod very much, mostly because I tend to shoot ants, which are moving. I would use a tripod a lot if I were shooting more stationary things, like Chrysalis.
Is there sort of a magic number or shutter speed? Hand holding these things? Like nothing needs something.
Maximum flash sync speed usually, so 1/250th of a second on my camera. So I usually get.
Have you ever tried, or what do you think about the backlighting using an overhead projector and putting a white piece of paper down and then putting the insect on that and perhaps using
Have you
flash
done that?
as well? No, I just thought of it when you were talking about light boxes.
I bet it would work. I would just, like anything else, try it out. I think that would work fine. The one thing that might be weird is if the color is somewhat different, so that the color coming from the overhead projector might be different than the color coming from your flash, and sometimes that looks a little weird if it's off. But yeah, I would try it. Mostly. Yes.
Do you have any particular way that you like a piece of equipment to hold flashes in place? Like
Oh yes, there's this wonderful thing called a magic arm. The Bogan, I guess it's Manfrotto now. It's literally an arm. It's two ball joints. It's like your own arm, two ball joints with an elbow joint in the middle. It's about this long, and it's got a really ingenious clamp on one end, and a place where you can attach a camera or a flash on the other, and you can position it and lock it into place. And what I've been doing recently is actually taking a tripod. Yeah, I do use a tripod sometimes. Taking a tripod out in the field, mounting a flash on the tripod, and taking the magic arm and using it to put a stick somewhere. And so I can position flash relative to subject. So I do use all these little clamps and things, but a magic arm, they're like $100, which is really pretty inexpensive for the build quality. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you say something briefly about how you manage all the thousands of photos? What program do you use?
Oh, I'm horrible at that. My computer's a mess. I really wouldn't ask me that question. I've recently started using Lightroom, which I really like. I think Lightroom's a really good bargain, and it does most of the things that you need to do to process a photograph you have in Lightroom rather than Photoshop. It does a better job than Photoshop does of the basic manipulations, and it also acts as a database to help keep track of things. I'm still exploring it, but right now I would say Lightroom's a really good program for that.
This is a technical question, but I know your website is very popular with educators and teachers, and you're very generous with letting people use your photographs for educational uses. About how many people do come to your website and ask for photographs?
How many ask? I don't know. I get email. I guess sometimes several emails a day from teachers, and sometimes nothing. But I would say probably fewer than a third of the people who actually use the images actually ask, which is fine because that's why I put part of my website a little statement saying if you're showing a classroom or educational, please use. And I'm hoping people do that because then it's less email for me. About 2,000 people a day visit the blog. Assuming it's not just my mom sitting there.
And then have you ever seen your photographs end up somewhere odd, some product or some ad that you didn't get permission for?
All the time,
Oh,
frequently.
really?
Yeah. there's a lot of sort of weird bedbug products that they actually put them on the label. There's these like sonic ant repellent things that are sold in Thailand that plastered all my images over. It's just, it's really kind of disheartening, to be honest, because I see them mostly internationally, but you know, I find lots of people using them in commercial contexts.
Do you follow up with that? I mean,
I try, but literally some of these images have, you know, 500 or 600 unauthorized copies floating around, and so I do like once a month I'll sit down and spend a day just doing takedown notices to the web host companies, and you know, but you know, I've learned in the process too that most of the people who are actually the businesses that are infringing them, it's not, I mean, it's legally their fault, but it's because they had their daughter's friend make a web page for them who didn't know any better or something. And so I've discovered if I'm not a jerk about it, that sometimes they'll actually buy the image from me and then come back and do more. So I've learned to be really nice and professional when contacting people who are using images without permission to say, hey, you know, take them down. Yeah, it's a big issue and getting worse, I would say. But do you guys know about Google's reverse image search? Does anyone use that?
No.
No? Okay, so you can now drag, this is new, like over the last few months. If you do a Google search for images, you can take one of those images that pops up in the results and drag it into the search bar. And Google will then tell you everywhere on the internet that image appears. So it's much easier to find where your images have gone. And here's where it's really helpful. If you're making a web page and you want to be really unique, if you're buying an image or you want to use an image that no one else is using, you can also figure out how widely used an image is. And you can maybe figure out where it came from, you know, by dragging it up. And it's a really useful tool. It's fun to play with because Google also tries to guess what it is. And it's usually not very good with insects. It makes this, you know, it shows you related images, and a lot of my ants end up looking like fashion models, they think. But it's fun to play with, but it is really useful for finding out where images are going. All right, how are we in time?
I think we have to quit, unfortunately. So
yeah.
Thanks again, Alex.
Started as curator of anthropology at the LSE.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. They were fired like 10 years ago. LSE was not. They were like laying people off.
Things are going great there now.
That is awesome. Yeah. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah. So whenever you're in LA, let me know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you know Brian Brown?
Yeah, I do. I sent him all my forward flies.
Okay, cool. Yeah. He's great. But if you're ever down there, let me know.